This is GARIS, Masculist, MGTOW flyers. That is 2 3-page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 384, entitled Masculism has its William Lloyd Garrison, but not yet its John Brown. This flyer description. This flyer describes the close historical analogy between the rise of abolitionism in the US in the 1800s and the rise of masculism in the 2000s, by stating that the masculist equivalent of William Lloyd Garrison, who created the first abolitionist newspaper in 1831, already exists, but that the masculist equivalent of a John Brown terrorist gang does not, but will probably exist within a decade, as masculist anger and hatred spread across the world as masculism lashes out at man's slavery, the way the abolitionists lashed out at negro slavery a century and a half ago. The flyer itself. Masculism has its William Lloyd Garrison, but not yet its John Brown. By Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. Those of you who are not familiar with American history, I need to explain who William Lloyd Garrison and John Brown were. They were ardent abolitionists in the 1800s in the US, bitterly opposed to the brutal institution of negro slavery and sought its abolition. William Lloyd Garrison was the first truly dedicated American abolitionist, publishing his abolitionist newspaper, The Liberator, starting in 1831. John Brown was an abolitionist terrorist who actually killed slavers of Negroes in Kansas, who tried to arm the Negroes by seizing a US federal armory at Harper's Ferry in Virginia in 1859. His plan was to distribute arms, 100,000 muskets, to the Negroes, who would then rebel against the institution of Negro slavery. His gang was mostly killed, and he was captured and later hanged 2 years before the outbreak of the US Civil War. His dying words were, "Now, if it's deemed necessary that I should forfeit my life for the furtherance of the ends of justice and mingle my blood further with the blood of my children and with the blood of millions in this slave country whose rights are disregarded by wicked, cruel and unjust enactments, I submit, so let it be done." The point of this flyer is to make the analogy that the main aim of masculism, namely to free men from man-slavery to fluffy parasite females, is closely historically analogous to the cause of the US abolitionists. Both the abolitionists and the masculists wanted and want to free a particular group of people from the horrors and moral abominations of slavery. In the case of the US abolitionists, they felt that Negro slavery was a moral abomination and pushed hard to have the institution of Negro slavery outlawed, which became the central cause of the US Civil War that took place from 1861 to 1865. In the case of the 21st century masculists, we feel that manslavery is a moral abomination that needs to be outlawed. The size of the problem faced by the masculists is hugely greater than that of the US abolitionists, since the Negro slaves were only about 1/10 of the US population, whereas the male population worldwide is several billion. Before pushing this historical analogy, which is the main theme of this flyer, I need to give some background on why the masculists see manslavery as slavery rather than as the natural state of affairs between the sexes. What changed that caused the masculists to see working for a woman as manslavery? To explain this, it might be helpful to ask a similar question about the rise of abolitionism, namely, why did it take until the 19th century for Western countries to see Negro slavery as a moral abomination? After all, slavery has been a staple feature of history for thousands of years. Greek and Roman civilizations were based on slavery. So what changed in the 19th century that caused the rise of the abolitionist movement? I'm not an expert on this question, so I can only speculate as follows. Due to the Industrial Revolution, economic standards of living rose, and people could afford to buy newspapers and books, which had a large market in the growing industrial cities. These books included the Bible, so that religious ethical values were able to propagate a lot more widely. The early abolitionists were able to publish horror images of slave ships that shocked and horrified their readers. People began to write novels about the horrors of slavery, the most famous one being Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was a major bestseller. In the northern states of the US, indignation rose against the institution of slavery, whereas in the southern states, the whole cotton-growing economy was based on slave labour, so it could not be thrown off willy-nilly. Americans are fascinated by the US Civil War, and I am too. I see close analogies between this war that was largely caused by the institution of Negro slavery and a much larger sex war between the sexes over the issue of manslavery. This is not to say that I foresee men going out into the streets killing large numbers of women, although some of that may occur, because ultimately women are both intellectually and physically weaker than men. So if men decide collectively to get angry at women for women's manslavery, then women will not stand a chance, because the ultimate backup of the law is brute male force, that is, physical force exerted by male cops. But when those male cops themselves become ideologically influenced by masculist ideas and go masculist themselves, then women will be fucked. Women will be forced to submit to superior male force, as they have always done over several million years. So to what extent does it make any sense to talk of a sex war if women are quite incapable of defeating men militarily? It will be a sex war in the sense of a bitter ideological war between the sexes, as men throw off their traditional role of being manslaves to women, working for women, to pay for women to have babies. Men have always been the supporters of women, so that women can concentrate on raising children, many children, half of whom died. So being a woman was a very demanding job, growing and raising children to adulthood to generate the next generation, so that humanity can continue to exist and not die out. However, a mere half-century ago, the greatest social revolution in history occurred, namely the male invention of the contraceptive pill, which caused shockwaves in gender politics. The pill is reliable and effective, allowing women to choose the number of children they want. And since raising a child in the US is so expensive now, that's $250,000, women choose to have only 0, 1 or 2 in most cases. This meant that women then had a career window of half a century in which they were free to earn a living, to work, that is, in paid employment. So millions of women streamed into the workforce only to find traditional male resistance to having to share the workplace with females. Thus rose the modern feminist movement, which pushed for the equality of pay for women, equality of opportunities, equal rights to enter the professions, etc. The rise of modern feminism naturally followed the invention of the contraceptive pill. Next was the turn of the Masculists, who argued that now that women can work, they must work. Anything else is man's slavery, and man's slavery is slavery. Slavery rouses passions. Slavery is a war issue, and the Masculists are at war against the fluffies, that is, traditional women who expect to be able to parasite off the money and labour of a man, aiming to wipe them out by totally ignoring them, not even pumping and dumping them, so that their fluffy parasite genes are removed from the gene pool. Fluffy parasites and fluffy feminists, that is, feminists who know nothing about masculism, who see men as cash machines to pay for women to have babies, are the enemy of the Masculists, not to be defeated in a sex war. To be defeated in a sex war in order to liberate men from man's slavery, from working for a woman for decades, so that she can have her kids raised in a middle-class house that he pays for. One particularly bitter point raised by the Masculists is that the fluffy feminists, in all their hypocrisy, have taken over the divorce courts and made them so toxic for men that 2/3 of young men in many countries now refuse to marry, reject paternity, and spend their money on themselves, thus making these fluffy feminists indirect genociders, wiping out whole populations, so have to be stopped, with bullets if necessary, in a sex war. In a typical fluffy feminist-dominated divorce court, a divorcing father will be seen by the fluffy feminist divorce court lawyers and judges who know nothing about masculism, who have no clue about masculist ideas, as a cash machine to be robbed and abused, forced to have his children ripped away from him with a 90% probability. He will lose his house to his fluffy ex-wife so that she can raise her kids in it. He will lose half of his wealth to her so that she can fleece him of half of the fruits of his lifelong efforts. He will be forced to pay child support to his kids, whom he will barely see, maybe 2 afternoons a month, and if his ex-wife is a real fluffy, he may be forced to pay her alimony for life, with no moral nor legal obligation on her to get off her fat parasitic ass and fip up and get a job, so that he is parasited upon after the divorce the way he was before the divorce. Anyone reading of the above horrors for men in the fluffy feminist hypocrite-dominated divorce courts, that is, hypocritical in the sense that these fluffy feminists want equal rights for women in the parliaments, but reject equal obligations with men in sharing up the burden of earning the living by not bothering to get a career-competent education so as to become a FIP, that's financially independent person, as an adult, and not expect to be able to parasite off the money and labour of a man, in brackets, agrees with Masculists that the above issues are a casus bellum, that is, a cause for war. With now 2/3 of young men rejecting marriage and paternity, and likely to rise over 90% within a decade, then these fluffy feminists have become indirect genociders. If 90% of men reject paternity, then we wipe ourselves out within a mere generation. So things have to change, in capitals. This is end of part 1.